All right, good evening, everyone. Hello. So, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's program at the Hudson Library. If you don't know me, my name is Kelsey. I'm an adult services librarian here at the Hudson Library. And I'd like to personally thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. I know it's been a little bit of cold weather up here in Ohio. So thank you again. Before we get started with tonight's discussion, I do have a few quick announcements. If you're a fan of mystery and thriller authors, we have, which, I mean, you should be, right?
Girls, what are you even doing here on a snowy day?
Exactly. We have a ton of authors lined up that you should really check out. On Thursday this week at 6:30, New York Times bestselling author Alifair Burke is going to be here to talk about her latest page-turner, The Note. We're also going to be hosting a local Cleveland native on Monday at 7 p.m. virtually, Lisa Black. Does anyone know Lisa Black? Exactly. She's going to be talking about her extensive knowledge in crime scene analytics and newest book, Not Who We Expect. And also, special announcement, because this is going to fill fast, on April 24th, David Baldacci, #1 New York Times bestselling author, will be here at the Hudson Library to talk about his newest standalone, Strangers in Time. So for more information, we host many, many, many programs here at the Hudson Library. So please feel free to go to our website, hudsonlibrary.org, for more information and to reserve your seats. Also, we have the Learned Owl in the back of the room right now selling copies of Nemesis, Gregg's newest book. So those are available for purchase and signing that we'll be doing after the program. Now, I'd like to introduce tonight's author and my conversation partner. Gregg Hurwitz is the New York Times #1 international best-selling author of 23 thrillers, including, here's the beginning of that series, the Orphan X series, and 2 award-winning thriller novels for teens. His novels have won numerous literary awards, graced top 10 lists, and have been published in 33 languages. Hurwitz currently serves as the co-president of International Thriller Writers, which is something I would love to talk about a little bit more tonight as well. So thank you so much for coming to Ohio and being here in Hudson.
Well, thank you. I have to say, as an Angelino, I'm having whiplash going from fires to this. We were evacuating like 3 weeks ago, and now I'm rolling in here. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much. Now, just last week, Nemesis, which is the 10th book in your Orphan X series, came out. For those in the audience who haven't had a chance to read it yet, can you give us a little summary of what we should be expecting to see?
Yeah, absolutely. How many of you have read any of the Orphan X books? Wow. Hello, family. So Orphan X, to recap, I should probably start there real quickly. So Evan Smoak, my protagonist, was taken out of a foster home at the age of 12, and he was trained up to be an assassin. He was pulled out and basically viewed as an expendable weapon. But the guy who took him out was a CIA station agent who trained him, actually loved this kid. So instead of this being this terrible, awful, tortured childhood where he's being raised to be a disposable weapon, which in fact he is, Jack Johns loved him. And so he went from this East Baltimore foster home to all of a sudden he was put in the world. He had to learn different languages. He had to learn etiquette. He had to learn eskrima knife fighting and sniping and hand-to-hand combat. And one of the things that Jack told him, or tells him when he's 12, and I quote it in every book because for me it's the key sentence around which the whole series coalesces, is he says to him, the hard part isn't making you a killer. The hard part's keeping you human. And so the book for me is very much about the process of Evan, who we meet when he's already been an assassin. He's gone places the U.S. government cannot go, and he's killed people in violation of international law, with the notion being he's fully expendable. If he ever gets caught or tortured to pieces or buried alive, no one's going to come for him. He's not even going to get a star on the wall at Langley the way that CIA officers do. And so that's really what this is about. And the one thing that I also repeat that he was never learned was how to speak the strange language of intimacy. He was taught everything except how to do that. And so the series really is about his process of becoming more and more of a human. And in Nemesis, he's up against his closest friend. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of friends. He's a lone wolf operator, but there's a guy called Tommy Stojak who is his armorer. He's a sniper. He's based on a friend of mine who passed away 4 years ago, who was just a crusty old early UDT diver, like pre-SEAL Team 6 diver. He used to say he was in the Wavy Navy. And he just blew stuff up. He was an incredible sniper and shooter. And I used to go visit him in Vegas, and he had this big armory that was just filled with enough ordnance to start, a land war in Europe. And he'd heft up like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher and say, "You want to go out back and play adult lawn darts?" And we'd go shoot stuff off in the desert. And so Tommy was is loosely based on this friend of mine. And Evan and him are super close. And this book is the first time in this process of becoming human that his code is on a collision course with someone he deeply cares about. And so it's him going up against Tommy. Tommy sold weapons to somebody that were used to kill innocents. And Evan has an inviolable code. And if you cross it, he's going to come for you and he's going to put you in the ground. And this is the first time that there's complications around what that code is. Evan's got a 1855 to nowhere. It's an encrypted line that people call when they're in desperate shape and they have nowhere else to turn. You can actually try calling that number and you can see what happens, because Orphan X will answer the phone. And so this is the first time that he's on this mission, and he's up against his best friend. And part of this was, for me, one of the things I notice a lot is that when people come from different belief structures, people don't understand people who think different or believe different or vote different. I've never heard anybody whose mind has changed by saying, "Oh, I had a new revelation after reading an op-ed in the Washington Post." It's not how we change our minds. How we change our minds almost always is through personal relationships, where we are close with somebody and they make meaning in the world and they believe things different from us, and we're shattering into that. And some part of that is we care about them enough that we have to re-examine our notions, and we have to figure out where they're wrong and maybe some of the ways that we're wrong. A friend is like a mirror in a lot of ways. And I open the book with a quotation from Tommy Stojak, and he says, "A friend is someone who's right when they tell you you're wrong." And so Evan is going for Tommy in this book, and it's the first time some readers have said that they're almost rooting against Evan. And so it's a collision of these two codes, and it's the most personal one in the series, and I hope you guys enjoy it.
That's really great. And I know you brought up this whole idea of like changing people's perspectives and minds. And this is actually something that you felt pretty personal about, if I remember from doing my research about you, in terms of today's kind of political climate and how people are very thinking one side versus the other. Can you talk a little bit about that and how maybe you've been involved in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do a lot of work pro bono on the side. Oddly, one of the things I say when I describe Orphan X as the nowhere man is he asks for no money, no credit, and no permission. And I say, if you don't need those three things, you can move the world. And so that's what I've done in a lot of my interventions. I do some spelunking into the culture against polarization and against extremism when it emerges. And I think part of that is my community has always been very, very rangy. I grew up pretty liberal. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a novelist. I'm a screenwriter. I live in Hollywood. Like, if I was more on brand, I'd be a Prius. But I was educated in a Jesuit high school. I have a lot of friends who are born-again Christian Navy SEAL snipers. I have a lot of friends in different communities. And I've done a lot of work trying to stitch the parties together, the political system together, in a sort of unified middle. I did a lot of work trying to pull the Democrats back from the far left. I'm doing some work now with the Republicans, who are now running things to make sure that they're also not sort of alienating the rest of the country. And so it's a constant process of understanding different ways that people think. I'll give a quick example. Have any of you heard of Big Five personality theory? Maybe, all right, we got one taker. Or the Myers-Briggs test. You remember the Myers-Briggs test where they rank you on introversion, extroversion, and it's got all that stuff. And a lot of people take that in high school. Well, it's a huge predictor of how we think politically. It's really interesting. So liberals, if you have a liberal mindset, you're higher, and one of the traits it measures is openness, trait openness. So what does openness mean? Openness means you like different ideas and foods and accents. So it's like, why do cities vote blue? Well, all the people who move there like exposure to all sorts of different things and different concepts and different ideas. Conservatives tend to be lower in trait openness, but they're higher in another trait, which is called high trait conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is like, do you show up on time? Do you return phone calls? You know, and liberals have a notion of thinking that they can just educate anybody into higher trait openness or higher trait empathy, which is pretty funny because it's like going up to Bill Clinton and saying, you know, can I just educate you into becoming an introvert? Like, these are fixed psychological states. And one way that you think about it is that liberalism with high trait openness is sort of the gas pedal, right, to moving forward in the culture. And conservatism often is the brakes, like, slow down, we got to look at traditions. So that lower trait openness that's more closed is why slogans like build a wall. Like, conservatives like to have boundaries around things and like to have borders, right? They like to have boundaries around, let's say, gender. So there's always these cross purposes. And the job of liberals is to come in and say, well, if you build a wall and you make it impenetrable, then new ideas, different ideas, and new people won't get in, and we're going to stagnate and die. And the negotiation between those two sides is how we negotiate and navigate complex change. So we need each other, and they're not distributed differently. It's every race, every religion, every gender has the same distribution. So whether your belief is that that's evolutionarily selected or God-given, it's how we're set up. We are set up to have different beliefs and to come at the world in different structures and to understand each other in different ways. And that's part of what happens in this book, because Tommy's, you know, they're in a rural small town, not unlike the one that Tommy grew up in, a rural town. And Evan's coming in from his perspective, and these two codes are just colliding, and they're trying to come at the world in different ways and seeing if they can forge this together into a center that might be able to hold.
That sounds very intense. But very relevant to today. And likewise, in a lot of your books, you also, you do tackle a lot of things that are currently happening in the world, new technologies, new weapon opportunities, things like that. How do you come up with these stories and these ideas? Do you have like inside people that you do your research with? Can you give us some stories on that?
I do have good inside people. I've done a lot of crazy stuff in the name of research. I've gone undercover into mind control cults. That was fascinating to figure out their inner workings. I've snuck onto demolition ranges with Navy SEALs to blow up cars. I've gone up and stunt airplanes, and I've gone through whitewater rapids, through the jungles of Oaxaca. So I like to go out in the field and really experience things firsthand, because then I can write about them in a way where I hope that you will have a front row seat to the action. And the aim for that is, like, before I started writing Orphan X, I trained in some mixed martial arts fighting for several months. I'm not implying I was good. It was mostly a process of having my face introduced to the training mat again and again. But when I'm experiencing something like getting choked out, I can write about it in a manner. See what I do for you people? I can write about it in a way that will bring it to life more. It's a very claustrophobic quality. Like, all of us, I assume, have been hit in the face at least once in our life, whether by a fist or a baseball or something. And like, face quality has a very distinctive quality of pain. It feels different than other types of pain. And likewise, if I'm being choked out, there's a sort of intense claustrophobia that I can describe differently. And what I'm aiming at is to never write in cliche, so that if you're reading it, I never want to end when someone's getting choked out to say, and then everything went black. I'm trying to really put you there. And so if I go and do it, and I'll tell you, like, here's one story that's a good example. My third book is a medical thriller called Do No Harm. And I had to interview this medical tech at a hospital. It was at UCLA Medical Center. And the only time he had to talk with me was while he was literally carving up a cadaver and parting it out to different departments for research. So the heads he was cutting off were going to neurology. The joints are going to orthopods. The feet are going to the podiatrists. And so I'm having this conversation with him, like wishing I'd worn galoshes. And he's carving this whole body up, and he finishes with the body, and he walks across the room, and there's giant doors, steel doors across the room, about the size of that whole wall. And he walks over and opens it, and inside are 24 corpses suspended from their heads in scissor-8 clamps that pinch them at the ears, and they're just hanging with their feet dangling about 2-3 feet off the ground. Now, corpses are stored that way so that the bodies don't distort, because if you store a body flat, it'll flatten out, and that makes it less useful for medical students when they're doing anatomy lessons, because it doesn't look like our natural anatomy. So if you store bodies floating and you put a figure-8 clamp on their heads, it preserves the bodies in their original form, for better or worse. So this was like the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. I just lit up, and he grabbed one by the arm and he pulled it on a chain across the ceiling and laid it down on the dissection table and started carving it up. Well, I was writing this book, and I had a scene where my doctor, who's my protagonist, is fleeing through the hospital late at night, and he needed somewhere to hide. And what was more perfect than that? And so part of the research that I do is to be open to opportunities, is to get on that scene and see what I can see in a way that makes it more vivid. One of the masters of this is Thomas Harris, who's one of my favorite thriller writers. He wrote Silence of the Lambs. He wrote, have any of you read Red Dragon? It's like a perfect thriller. Red Dragon's, to me, that's the perfect thriller. But when he wrote Hannibal, I was giving you an example of how these telling details, when they work well, they have a ring of verisimilitude to them. Like there's a truth in them. So it's not just like when you see a movie in all the streets of LA, like a Michael Bay movie, he'll spray all the streets down so they're shiny, but it looks sort of fake and generated. And what you want is to find things that are creepy and compelling, but feel like they're real in the world. So in Hannibal, there's a great scene he opens up where Clarice Starling is with a SWAT team, and they're in the back of a truck, and they're waiting to pop out and have a raid, and it's in the South where a lot of the stories take place, and so it's hot and it's humid and it's miserable. And if you're in the back of a van and you're waiting with a crew of tacked up men, it gets hot real fast, but you can't run the van for the air conditioning because then you're going to look conspicuous. And so what they do is they bring in a block of dry ice. So they're sitting in the back and the ice is just misting off. And when it's time to do the raid, they kick the door open and the SWAT team emerges from this mist of ice. And so the effect is really, really compelling because there's a reason that makes sense that's tied to the plot and is tied to the action, but it also has this incredible aspect of badassery to it because that's the kind of thing that we want. And so when you can tie the visuals in a way that's real and do that research and find those facts, that's what I love to bring to you guys in hopes that you'll appreciate it when, you know, I'm getting myself choked out on a mat.
The things he's doing for us as readers, impressive. Now, you were mentioning a lot there about what makes a good thriller. And, you know, when we think of thrillers, you know, your mind honestly can just go immediately to nonstop action, the exciting twists and turns, and of course, explosions, right? But you're really unique because I think it's different how you also incorporate a lot of elements of meditation and mindfulness in your books, something that I personally have not come across in a lot of the thrillers and even mysteries that I read as a reader. So I'm curious, can you explain a little bit about that inclusion and that balance and why you decided to do that?
I've never been asked that in 10 books, so that's a very good question. Look, what we love and why we read and why we watch things, it's always character. Like when people say, what's more important, character or plot? Plot is just character in motion. So if I asked you all right now, I said, what's your favorite James Bond action sequence? You're all going to stop and think for a minute, but we all know how he takes his martini. So when we're returning to a character, we're returning to spend time with somebody who is a character who engages in the world in a way that's specific. So an Orphan X action sequence, it can't be replaced with Jack Reacher. It can't be replaced with Jason Bourne. Every aspect of it has to accrue to character, has to come back to character. And one of the things with Evan is he was raised with these very rigid 10 assassins commandments. First one is assume nothing. The second one is how you do anything is how you do everything. And he's got this real rigidity, and it lapses at times into OCD for him, where he needs excessive cleanliness or order. He lives in a penthouse apartment where everything is sort of, you know, smudge free. It's got poured concrete surfaces and stainless steel, but it's also lifeless in a certain way. And so the meditation for him is part of him trying to tame that compulsion to get stuck in a loop. The second commandment, that's the one that's how you do anything is how you do everything. That's the most popular. Like soldiers have that, they've gotten that tattooed on them. People have had, you know, shirts made, jewelry made with it. I had a woman who had like a gold bangle made with it. I'm like, all right, well, use it where you want it. And CEOs have used that in lectures. People have used it in parenting. So it really connects with people. And that basically means that things are fractal. So you have to bring perfection to every element. But you can also see where that could get him stuck in an OCD loop, especially if something is hitting him harder in an area where there might be trauma. And so the mindful awareness meditation is two things. It's to keep that OCD at bay and keep it in its proper place. But there's another thing that I've discovered, which is super weird, and you all are going to think I'm like a left coast like weirdo for saying this. But I did a lot of sports when I was younger. I have a lot of injuries. I was a pole vaulter in college, and I played a lot of soccer, and I broke my collarbone, and just lots of broken bones. And I've started doing hot yoga, like 115 degrees yoga, where you're just like drenched at the end of it. And there's one form of that where it's deep stretch. It's really good for healing injuries, because I had like double hip surgery, and I'm kind of a train wreck. And you hold a pose for 5 minutes in 115 degrees, and very slowly. It's not just that your muscles relax or your tendons even. You want to get into and actually open up the fascia. And one of the things I started to discover is when I do this at the end of a day, and you hold a pose, and very, very slowly, sometimes by the end of the pose, you'll open up a joint or part of your body by like a full 2 inches. It's really pronounced. And one of the things that I found was that I was talking about everything being fractal. Flexibility, physical flexibility, is also linked to emotional flexibility, is also linked to psychological flexibility, is also linked in some ways to spiritual flexibility or creative flexibility. And it makes a weird sense if you think about our physiology. So y'all know the Rocky stance that Rocky has his arms up. If you hold that stance, your confidence goes up. Right? The way that we stand can change your confidence. People talk about this. I mean, of course, it makes sense. If you stand up straight and your shoulders are back, you're going to be more confident. And if you're defeated, and you can see people, we read their emotion. And if how we hold ourselves over time can start to alter how we feel, it's how we're perceived, they cause different feedback loops. And so what was really interesting to me when I was doing some of these meditations or stretches is if you can broaden yourself out, and that spikes your dopamine levels, then there's also other poses that do different things. And so a prayer posture, there's one called, it's puppy dog posture, where your knees are up, but you put your arms out in front of you. It's sort of like a prayer posture almost. It's a heart opener, where you're pushing down, and so the intercostals are flexing open to the ground, and in the heat, it's really, really pronounced. That's a posture of humility. But it's also a posture that's grounding. So it's really interesting as you see that represented in prayer across all kinds of different cultures. And so part of it for him is, and so one of the things I realized is at the end of a day, if I'm writing, I work out, I'm doing whatever, if I go and do this, it will increase my creative flexibility. I'll get new ideas that are broader about the books. And so I'll have a bunch of scenes that I wrote, and then if I go do this, I'll come out of it and have like a big idea about how to tackle it differently or a way to rearrange it. And so part of him doing this is him setting himself in order in a very specific way before the missions to make sure he's not just physically sound, but it also is a way for him to access different modes of thinking and to see things. One of the rules he operates by on these missions is, the Zen beginner's mind is that the aim of a Zen meditation is to see everything as if it's happening for the first time. So he can notice if a deadbolt is offset by 1/8 of an inch. He wants to be aware of everything. And there's so many times that we go into rote, behaviors. There's times when I'll drive home from somewhere and I won't even remember the drive. There's times where we go down and you can't even remember it. We do this with eating sometimes, where we're moving subconsciously, especially as we ritualize things. And one of the aims of meditation is to view everything as if you're experiencing it for the first time. And that can be true in a relationship, right? If you're in a rut conversationally, if you can stop and open up that space where you're more aware and present, it can kind of alter everything. So for him, as a sort of Zen-based assassin, it's incredibly useful to him.
I also see the connections too earlier when you were talking about how you put this in the book, that it's easy to be an assassin, but hard to maintain being a human. And I feel like that the meditation elements can also bring you back to center in terms of who you are as a person too.
Definitely. I mean, it increases emotional flexibility. I mean, so they call these stretches heart openers, but it's funny because if you actually do them, you notice that you have shifts in your physiological posture that alter how you feel emotionally and psychologically.
Right.
So let's all do some exercises now, shall we?
Yes, we can do some exercises in a few minutes. Now, so we've learned a lot about you this evening, that you're putting yourself on the line to get these experiences, to give us a front row experience, that you do have a lot of similarities. Do you see yourself in these books at times?
Yeah, I mean, I always laugh. You know when you go to a movie and it says, you know, it's some movie, it says, you know, it's science fiction movie or something, but it always says like based on real world events. And I always think, what isn't? Like, it's not like we can generate some plot from nothing we've ever experienced. So there's so much of me in the stories in all of the characters. There's a lot of me in Evan in different ways, but in all the characters, it's really about trying to occupy different perspectives. And you'd asked earlier about some of the work that I do in the culture. It's really more for me a cultural interest than political, because politics don't interest me that much, but how we get locked in stories that get us off course is much more interesting to me. So my engagement in politics is more to make sure that we're not tearing ourselves apart as a country, especially at the behest of, you know, hostile regimes that are delighted to see that. But why I think I'm interested in doing that is that as a novelist, I'm not interested in putting forth an ideology somehow with the characters. I mean, there's some people who write, if you're writing for ideology or you're writing and you have everything figured out, you're not creating art, you're creating propaganda. And so, you know, and that's what like Atlas Shrugged is for, right? We know in certain books that they're there as a tome, like that's a tome that's expressing a sort of great man libertarian value set. It's wonderful, it's charming, she's talented, but you're not going to be surprised by it. And a lot of what I'm trying to do when I write a character is to pull their face mask on and to see the world through their eye holes. So I spend a lot of time with SEALs, Navy SEALs with snipers. I'm seeing how they act in a room. My father's a physician, and I remember being at dinner with him, and there was a waiter of a certain age who came over and was shuffling with a dropped foot. And my dad said, he probably had polio when he was young. Like, my dad sees everything like a doctor. You know, if someone's in the military, the way they sit, where their eyes go, it's a very different set of rules for that. Joey always thinks, Josephine Morales, a 17-year-old hacker, troublemaker who he's in charge of, always is thinking in terms of like network intrusions. And so we all come at the world in different ways. And what I'm really trying to do more than anything is to occupy those characters all the way down. And I think that in some ways is what, at times when I can be beneficial in the cultural conversation, it's because my curiosity outpaces my judgment. I'm way more interested in understanding exactly how somebody thinks and to occupy that space than bringing my own judgment and trying to change what they are, at least initially. Because you can't change someone's mind unless you understand where they're coming from. And there's some precedent in this, very interestingly, in psychology. I mean, there's a psychologist called Carl Rogers that some of you might have heard of. He's the one we make fun of when we say, "And how did that make you feel?" That's Carl Rogers. And he did something super interesting, which was when Freud used to have a patient, the patient would lay on the couch, right? Freud's sitting here with his pipe. He's probably smoking opium, because that's what Freud did a lot. And the patient is laying on their back staring at the ceiling. And the ceiling was supposed to represent sort of it's a landscape on which you can project the unconscious contents of your mind. And the psychologist is very separate from that and taking notes. And Rogers sat the patient up and stared at him face to face. So he literally switched the perspective. And he believed in something called unconditional positive regard, which meant you have to fully enter in your focus to the other patient in order to be able to help them. But what's amazing that he realized was that to really listen to somebody, you're not just listening to what they say, you actually have to get your nervous system in resonance with their nervous system. And you guys will know this. If you have friends who are depressed and you spend time with them, or family members are going through that, you're depressed. Like, there's osmosis that happens when we're with people. If you're with someone who's really manic and high energy, we take that on. We're porous. And so when I'm writing a character, in a lot of ways, I'm trying to get resonant with where they are and how they think and how they see the world and what they're going to sound like and what their energy is. And so occupying those different spaces is really what the goal is.
That's really impressive. You've mentioned a lot about your different passions and things like that tonight. And there's one last question I want to ask you before we turn to audience questions. We have a very large author and writer community here in Hudson, Ohio. We used to even have a writers group. And I think you're one of the best people to ask this because you are co-president of the International Thriller Writers. So thank you for that. What advice do you have for any aspiring writer in the audience tonight or maybe watching this event after the fact? What advice do you have for the career, for the process, or anything like that?
I'd say there's three things. The first thing is you have to love that actually doing the writing. I mean, one of the things is I meet lots of people who want to be writers, and I meet many fewer people who actually want to write. So, you know, it's really has to be that you love the craft, because it's not just the concept of being a writer. The other thing I'll say that's really important is getting your ass in the chair, like just ass in chair time. It's gotta be regular. It's like working out. You know, when you start, if you get used to going to the gym, you can go to the gym, right? And you can start to hit that tempo and get used to it. If you're, you know, when you study, having regular times that you study. And so writing's like a muscle, and you have to build that up. Other thing I'll say, I have a couple more pieces of advice, is don't be afraid to make mistakes. Just rush to failure. If you can't fix a blank page, but if you have something down on the page, you can always rewrite it, you can always make it better. And so I'm always urging people to just commit to having a vomit draft. Just sit down and get a bunch of stuff out there, it doesn't matter how bad it is, and then play with it. But you want the action of writing and of rewriting. And the last thing I'll say is that you have to make your writing time sacrosanct. You have to just elevate it and decide. Being a writer, being an artist of almost any kind, there's an aspect to it that's selfish. It's like being an athlete. When you're an athlete, you have to commit to your time training. You have to have your schedule. And being a writer, like, no one cares. Nobody cares if you're going to write a book. Nobody cares what your schedule is. It's not like you're, you know, a dentist and you have your hours where you're, you know, doing operations. It's not like you're a lawyer where you have billable hours and you're behind your desk. And if you don't decide and commit for yourself that this time is something that's sacred, that you're going to commit to and carve out, everyone will push the boundaries. You'll allow them to get pushed. Your procrastination will get them pushed, because there's always something way more pressing than spending day 57 out of 365 writing on a book. You got to get your dry cleaning, you got to clean your office, you got to take the dog for a walk, you know, you have kids, you have relationships. Everything will crowd in on it. So it's your job, if this is what you want to do, to kind of prove it and shoulder that responsibility to make that time something that isn't violated by your circumstances or your own procrastination. So that's the set of advice I would give.
Well, I think that's some fantastic advice. Last fall, I actually interviewed Dean Koontz, who had similar stuff, and he personally has a philosophy of setting aside that time where he will not be interrupted no matter what, in these set windows every day, because you have to keep doing that. So I think that's some fantastic advice. Now, I know we have a lot of diehard fans in the audience who probably have some really great questions, and we'd like to do some audience questions before we move on to the signing. So I'm going to be hopping down and walking around the room. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and I will come to you with the microphone. So feel free. Was it your hand up? Okay, I'm coming around to you. You'll be next. All right, just make sure you speak into the microphone so everyone can hear.
Sure. Thank you. I've just kind of always wondered this. The chapter titles, do you go back through and pull those lines from the chapters, or do you sometimes have an idea like a PhD that could win a bar fight? Was that something you wanted to put in the book in Nemesis, and then you made it a chapter title? I've just always wondered.
So I name all the chapters. It's funny. I was with. There's a wonderful writer called David McCloskey. His first book was Damascus Station. He was 8 years in the CIA. He interviewed me, I think it was yesterday, in Dallas. I forget sometimes with the tour where I am. And he said, he was joking because he's got young kids. He said, I noticed that like in Hardy Boy books, you name all your chapters. I said, well, that's not a parallel I was shooting for. But yeah, every chapter I highlight something. And for me, the win is always when it can be interpreted two different ways. And the chapter heading always appears somewhere in the chapter itself. And it's a really fun way of doing it. It's never the driver of the chapter. Usually I finish the chapter and then I go back and look. And now and then when I have an idea, whether it's a snippet of dialogue or a notion, I'll put it in my notes to just say that would also be a cool chapter deadline or chapter title. Now the one you're referring to is from the OSS, which is the agency that predated the CIA. And they used to say that their ideal recruit was a PhD who could win a bar fight. And that's my description of Evan Smoak, because he's educated. Jack educates him in all these ways, but all of his learning is stapled to the ground. It's not like today sometimes where you see academia can float out of the realm of the practical. One of the things I have observed is that reality is where ideology goes to die. And so all of Evan's learning is drilled into the earth because it's there so that he doesn't get himself killed. That's why he understands etiquette in Russia and which accent to use in which, country of speaking Spanish. And so he's, he's a blue collar Renaissance man, and he's a PhD who could win a bar fight. So that's where that one came from.
You had a question, right?
Yeah.
You can talk into the microphone.
Okay. Hi. I'm
Hi.
going to ask you real quick, where did you get the idea for the vodka connoisseur? Is that come from real life? And also, tell us about your Rhodesian Ridgebacks that you love in real life, too. Tell us a little bit about
These
them.
are two booze and dogs. Are you kidding me? This is what I flew to Ohio for in the winter. We're gonna be here all night, people. Someone bring out a flask. So let's start with the vodka. So my preferred drink, I love vodka and I love gin. I mean, I just like booze. I like hard alcohol. But probably my preference is bourbon myself. But you have to pick what affiliates with the character most closely. And vodka is the purest liquid in the world. What's really fun for me is now if I write about a vodka, their sales go up. So all the best vodka distilleries in the world send me like emblazoned bottles. It's amazing. So next book, I'm going to put in like a personalized Bentley. I'm just going to see how far I can keep pushing the product placement. And vodka is incredibly varied. There's wheat vodkas, there's grape-based vodkas. There's one Persian distiller who makes a raisin-based vodka. And why Evan drinks vodka is that vodka is, in a lot of ways, the purest liquid on earth. It's the most distilled, right? It's the purest of all of the boozes. And what it represents is the same alchemical process by which he went from sort of a 12-year-old unwanted foster kid, and he was transformed through his training into something that's pure. And that distillation process, when he drinks it, he's like imbibing this alchemical tool in a purification ceremony almost that represents his training. And he never gets drunk, except for once at the beginning of Lone Wolf, for good reason. He takes like 2 or 3 sips. He never drinks too much, but it really represents and resonates with his character, and that's why I chose it. Now, as for Rhodesian Ridgebacks are the best dogs in the world. Have any of you seen Ridgebacks before? They're just the best. Part of why I love Ridgebacks is, so when I went to public schools all the way through. My parents sent me off to a Jesuit high school, and I didn't know a single person there. I was from a Jewish secular background. I was the smallest kid in a school of 1,200 boys. And when you go to a new school and you don't know anybody, and it's a different belief system that you have to figure out, the last breed that you want in the car when your parents are dropping you off is the breed that my parents had, straight from the groomer with ribbons in their hair, which were standard poodles, which my dad would drop me off in his white Acura, and I'd be dying. I was like, Dad, pick me up 8 blocks from campus and wear Groucho Marx glasses. And I always wanted just a big archetypal dog-looking dog. And Ridgebacks, they have that big Marmaduke head, and they're just amazing. They're amazing. So the Brits, who were unparalleled at dog breeding when they were in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, there was this little dog that had a streak of reversed fur down its spine, and nobody knew what that's from. We still don't really know what that's from. And they basically realized this dog was utterly fearless. They would pursue lions, and they wanted to have dogs who they could train to hunt lions, the way that other dogs on a fox hunt will track foxes. And so they bred them with mastiffs for breadth and Great Danes for height and sight and scent hounds. And so they built basically the most perfect dog, and I love them. We got 4 of them now, and they range from 90 pounds to 125 pounds. Our big boy's going to get up to about 130, I think now. He's just a monster. And we raised them. It's so funny. I didn't want a female at all. My wife was finally like, I want a smaller dog that can't just like block me on the stairs so I can't get up the stairs. My wife is kind of tiny. She's a little pocket wife. And so she wanted a smaller dog. And then I kept breed shaming her every time she brought up another breed. So we got this runt female. She's only 90 pounds, but to me, she's tiny. And she just like wrecked me. Like I didn't want her at all. And she was adorable. She was so small, she'd curl up and like sleep on my chest. And so I let her up on the furniture. And then, of course, my wife and daughter petitioned that it was unfair to not let the other dogs, who were 125 pounds, up on the furniture. And so next thing you know, we're buying like bigger couches. And we raise these dogs like they're super cuddly. They still think they're lap dogs because I raise them all over me. And so if people come to the house now, we have this giant couch, and everyone sits there, and like everybody gets a Ridgeback in their lap around the couches. They're just ridiculous, and I just adore them. So I think I got my 23andMe back, and I think I'm like 6% Rhodesian Ridgeback. It's in the mix somewhere.
All right, so we have time for a couple more. So I saw your hand's been up.
All right, so first of all, I have a 13-pound Cavapoo, which I think is the best dog in the world, but doesn't chase lions at all. There's an old saying that everyone has a book in them, right? And so I've had one in me for 20 years and never pursued it at all. And an author friend of mine recommended Save the Cat to me, which I started reading. And it talks about plotters versus plotters.
Pantsers, yeah.
Pantsers. Sorry, you knew it.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, and I feel like I've started plotting more than pantsing because I'm not writing yet. And I guess my question is one way better? I guess first off, how do you do it? And then second off, can you reach an end no matter which way you choose?
Everyone pursues it differently. So the first thing I'll say is beware of any writing advice, because there's all these rules. I'll give you a bunch of rules, and if they don't work for you, throw them all out. I started off, I'm a really weird mix of the two. It drives everyone crazy because everyone has these big, like, I'm a pantser and I'm a plotter. And I write now with a rolling outline, I call it. I bought a big old widescreen TV monitor. I clamped it on my desk, and I have 2 documents side by side on it. And one of them is just a raft of bullet points. Before I start a book, I have 17 to 25 pages of just bullet points shaped up, snippets of dialogue, character beats, action sequences, moments of violence, themes. It's just a mess. And then before I'm writing the book, I usually know the first couple chapters. And so I'll kind of shape them up roughly. I think of writing like, those indoor rock climbing walls? Have you seen those? And so I know roughly where these big holds are. Like there's a big chunky scene in the middle of the second act, but I don't know if I'm going to get there with my left hand or my right foot. And I don't want to lock it in too much because I discover so much when I'm writing. By the time I start writing, I might learn more about character, and I might be open to opportunity. And so I might be in the middle of something and go, wait a minute, this is a cool opportunity. Let me drop a handkerchief here. I'll pay it off in the second act, and we can bring it around in the third act. So I'm constantly writing on this outline, and it's evolving. And as I write, I kind of shape up the scenes that are ahead. And now and then I'll write for a while, then I'll go into the outline and hammer it in a better shape. And basically that outline bloats, and then and I always think it's never going to stop bloating. It's going to be a 900-page Tolstoy novel without all the Russian angst. And then at some point, finally, it starts to shrink. And when I'm done, this document is empty, and I have a 400-page novel over here. And so I need that flexibility because I can't outline everything because I discover so much when I'm writing, but I also need to keep track of it. So that's the approach that I take. And you'll figure out what's for you. I mean, the one thing I'd say, if you think you have a book in you and you've been waiting for 20 years and you're reading a lot of stuff and you're outlining a lot, just think about sitting down and be like, what's the opening you want? What's the best first sentence? What's that best first chapter? And see what that feels like. Because that's the difference between reading about airplanes and flying. And just let yourself go. Get that first chapter down. You can always throw it out. You can always rewrite it. Get going,
That's some great advice. So we have time for one more question. So
We have to have 2 more, though.
2 more.
All right.
All right.
These 2.
We just got to make sure we have enough time for the signing.
Okay.
How did you research the tower?
Oh, no. The Tower is my first book. I started when I was 19 years old. I was fortunate enough to sell it, but so that's good. What's bad is nobody should ever be held accountable for anything they said or thought when they were 19 years old. So when I go back and read it, it's a little cringy. This was pre-internet, which is so wild. I've been doing this for so long. It's kind of crazy. And so I really had to, now I have a great Rolodex. I got a Rolodex with snipers and professors and porn stars and demolition breachers and anybody who I want to reach out to, I can through this weird, it's almost like mafia introductions. If I need someone in the Secret Service, I can call a buddy who's an Army Ranger who deployed with a CIA guy who once was roommates with somebody. Starting out, there was none of that. It's a book about psychological profiling. I read all of John Douglas's books. John Douglas is the father of psychological profiling. He wrote a book called Mindhunter. Incredible book. If you saw Silence of the Lambs, Scott Glenn's character, Jack Crawford, is based on John Douglas. So I read 7 of his books, and I actually met him at a signing in a Brentanos. Remember when there was Brentanos? It's another one of our defunct borders. And I brought the stack of books from him to sign. So I had to read everything. And then I didn't have those relationships yet to get to anybody. I didn't have any publishing record. So my sister's college roommate's dad was in the FBI. And I called him and was like, what weapons do people use? And I was just calling everywhere. And the one thing I learned, and this is really useful to those of you who are aspiring writers, is to do all the research. People really like to talk about what they do and why they do it, but they don't want to be treated like Wikipedia. So I tried to do as much research as I could back then with books and articles and things before going to people, so that I'm asking questions at a higher level that's really about how they see the world and what their philosophy of the world is. But it was tough. And I was 19, 20-year-old kid, and I looked even younger. It's not easy. It wasn't easy, but I was determined.
All right, and then last but not
question here.
least, I believe is you in the front.
So I've been reading quite a bit. I've just about read all your books. And I'm hoping that in Evan's future, there'll be some romance. Only because, I know this sounds silly, but he's with that lady in the building that has the little boy. He's also had some nice things to say about Joey when she gets dressed up. And I'm like, vodka aside, is he ever going to feel that kind of humanity?
That's a good question, but Joey is 17 and more like his daughter, so we got to keep some firm boundaries there, young lady. But Mia, who lives downstairs from him, is in a lot of ways she's a logical counterpart. I talked about how his penthouse apartment has all these hard surfaces, and Mia downstairs, she's all kind of heart and emotion. She's brilliant. She's a DA, but she's got dishes in the sink, and she's got laundry, and she's got crayons on the carpet, and it's a messy real house. She has scented candles and throw pillows. It's all the stuff that he doesn't understand. It's all that mess of intimacy. And so she, in a lot of ways, has that part of him. He does have a flirtation, which I'm sure you've noticed, with Candy McClure, who is Orphan V, who's very much a femme fatale in a lot of regards. And he has had relations or dalliances with Melinda Trong, who is his expert in counterfeiting and papers. And so he has different relationships. And part of that quest to becoming more human is to see, that's the toughest of all of the intimacies to break through and figure out. So he's on course. We'll see how he does. I don't know.
I guess we'll just have to see in future installments, right?
That's right. You got to keep buying the books, people.
Speaking of which, a variety of copies of various titles are available for sale in the back by the Learned Owl. We're about now going to move to the reception. So if you would like to do a brief meeting, greeting, photo op, signage of the book, anything like that, Gregg's going to be over here. Again, thank you so much. Thank you, Gregg.
Thank you.